Okay, so we're going to be talking about cognitive behavioral therapy, which is essentially impacting our behavior based on the way we think, and as a result of that, how we behave. So let's go through what the objectives are. So we're going to introduce you to the CBT concepts. I'm going to talk to you about something called cognitive distortions, which is essentially thinking in a way that is often not within our conscious thinking, but also it's irrational and it's inaccurate type of thoughts that often lead us to have certain feelings or certain behaviors, but it's really based on misinformation. So we're going to talk about cognitive distortion. I'm going to tell you about 3 steps by which you can try to tackle these type of so-called cognitive distortions in order to have improved mood, and then we'll tie that into how why it matters for sleep. So let's talk about CBT. So C is for cognitive, or the way we think. Behavior obviously is the way we act, so our actions, right? And then therapy part is just that. And then CBT insomnia, which is the type of training we're dealing with, specifically addresses thoughts and behaviors that impact our sleep. So when we're talking about CBT concepts, it is important to note that the model, the CBT model, assumes the following assumptions. So let's take it one at a time. So you got these 4 circles, and all the arrows essentially tell you that each of the circle affects all the other 3 circles, and they all affect each other, right? So the top ones are physical, which is essentially, for the purposes of this, would be your brain as the organ. This one has to do with your emotions or feelings, right? The F word that a lot of us are afraid of. This one is the cognition. So that's the C, right? Or our thinking. And then this one is our behaviors or our actions. So if you are stressed out about something, you are feeling that, right? So this tends to be our radar, essentially our warning system. So this is how we know that we are experiencing something, the experience, right? So let me explain that. So physically, what might be some physical signs that you are feeling distress? So what might be some physical signs, right? So you may feel tension in your muscles. You may have a headache. You may have insomnia, right? Sleep issues, difficulty falling asleep, things like that. As far as the feelings go, you may feel anxious. You may feel embarrassed, right? You may feel angry, depressed. Those are some of the negative emotions. Obviously, we can also feel happy, content, so on and so forth. But this is the radar system. So when you are experiencing something negative, either you feel it emotionally or you feel it physically, right? So that's how you know that there's something off with you. However, one of the biggest driver of our mental state is our cognition. So the way we think and our behavior, the way we behave. So what are some of the modifiable things in these? So I'm going to put the letter M next to the ones that are modifiable. So this is modifiable, this is modifiable, this is modifiable. Can you modify emotions? Can you tell someone to feel happy or to feel sad? Not really. So even though our end goal is to have appropriate emotions, we can't really force ourselves to feel that way, right? Ultimately, for most of us, we want to feel happy when it's appropriate. So now that brings me to my next goal here, which is to discuss what are our goals for this, right? So what are our goals for each of these domains? So for the physical domain, I would argue that our goal is we want to be well balanced, right? So some people say chemically balanced as far as our brain goes. We want to be healthy, right? We want to be physically healthy. As far as emotion goes, appropriate emotion. So, for example, if you are at someone's wedding, you want to have positive emotions, feeling happy for them, etc. But if you're at a funeral, you'd want to have feelings that are more consistent with grief, right? How about what's the goal for our behavior? So for our behavior, the goal is to have productive behavior as opposed to unproductive behavior. And then finally, what is the goal for our thinking? So you might say that we need to have positive thoughts. I hear that a lot from when I'm doing this clinically with people, and that's not necessarily the case. So we don't necessarily want to have positive thoughts all the time. There are times when you need to have negative thoughts. For example, if you're being chased by a lion, you need to have negative thoughts, which is this lion is going to eat me. And then the appropriate and productive behavior in response to those type of thinking is going to be what? Run away. The appropriate emotion in response to a lion chasing you would be what? Terror, right? Feeling terrorized, feeling afraid. And then the appropriate physical sensation or response when a lion is chasing you would be what? Racing heart, sweating, getting your body ready for that fight or flight response, essentially. So the goal for our thinking is really to have accurate or rational thoughts. Okay, so the whole objective of this module is going to be focusing on these ideas. So this is probably the most important point in all of this talk. And how this will translate into insomnia, we're going to come back to that in a second. All right. So let's give an example. Let me give you an example, right? So here's the example. Here's a scenario. You are late to an important meeting at work. And this is, say, the first time you're going to be dealing with an important boss or a supervisor, so on and so forth. You're running late. So it's happening right now. You know you're not going to be able to make it. You got your fancy GPS. You're driving, but it's not working for you, right? So what are you going to do? So we mentioned that you're going to feel the radar, right? The radar, or how you know you're going to experience from that, is through the top two circles, the top two domains, right? The circles are there just to help organize this. But what would be some physical symptoms? You might have racing heart, you might have tense body, right? You might even have a headache. And what might be some feelings you might have? You might feel ashamed. What else? You might feel what? Anxious, right? So those would be the feelings associated with the scenario of running late. So why might this be? Why am I feeling this way, right? So why am I feeling this way? And here's the thing. Our feelings are driven by our thinking, which is driven by something called our core beliefs. Core beliefs. So you might have some beliefs about the world, how the world should work, how the world should operate, right? So the way you were raised, the type of development you've had. One of your beliefs may be that adults or responsible people show up on time to their obligations. So this is what you believe about the world. This is what you expect of yourself. This is what you expect of the world. So these type of beliefs that we have, it's also called a schema, right? So don't worry about all this fancy terminology. It's also called schema, comes from schematics, right? That's the map, that's the roadmap that we use to define the way we're going to deal with the world. And then the thought would be something that we'll come back to in a second, but the ultimate feeling is what? Anxious, right? Or embarrassed. So this may be the feeling. So the first thing you're going to feel is the way your body feels, the top circles, or the way you emotionally feel, which is going to be I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling embarrassed, right? Those two. Then the question is going to be, why am I feeling this way? Well, you're going to start off with I think, and then you're going to try to fill in the blank. I think I feel anxious because I'm worried about the way my boss is going to think of me, right? So I am worried how I'll be perceived by my boss, right? So therefore I feel embarrassed, and so on and so forth. And then lastly is going to be our behavior. So what might be some unproductive behaviors or actions that may result from this anxiety and embarrassment? Well, you might decide, I'm not going to show up at all to this meeting. Screw this, right? So no show to the meeting. Not very productive. You're going to miss out on all the information. You could have still caught up with 50 minutes of the meeting if you were 10 minutes late. So 50 minutes is better than no minutes, right? So not very productive. Or you might have some other behaviors. You might start speeding on the road to try to beat the clock. Not good, right? You'll end up with a ticket and points and so on. So this would be some examples of of behaviors that may not be good. So hopefully you're tracking so far. What we're trying to get to is that you may have behaviors related to sleep that are driven by your emotions about sleep, that are driven by your thoughts, and they may be about sleep, or they may be more global thoughts, which is driven by some beliefs you have about the world and yourself and other people in general. And so what we want to help you with is to master the way you think and be able to analyze that. So in order to do this, we're going to tell you some techniques, but let me just do this. So for this gentleman, his initial thought, as he thought about why he's feeling anxious, he came up with this thought that I'm worried I'll be perceived, how I will be perceived by my boss, and then he'll try to think so why, so what if my boss perceives me a certain way. So if boss perceives him negatively, right, then he won't get the promotion, for example. And then we're gonna peel this onion more and more. So if the boss perceives me negatively and I don't get the promotion, then what? Then I won't get the pay raise, right? No pay raise. If I don't get the pay raise, then what? Then I'm not able to meet my obligations as a father, right? And then essentially I'm a failure as a father. So people really think this way. They may initially have some very kind of minor type of neutral sounding thought, but when you try to dig deeper and deeper, he cares about the perception of the boss because he cares about the promotion. He cares about the promotion because he cares about earning more money. He cares about earning more money because he wants to better provide for his family, and ultimately the reason for that is because he wants to be a good father, right? So backtracking this a little bit, it's possible that one of the core beliefs this individual might have is that you must be a successful father, which may translate to money, right? So that may be one of the core beliefs, right? And it won't be an unusual belief that someone might have. So nothing unusual there, right? So far, so good. So what happened is this individual has certain core beliefs. Those then drive these thoughts. Now these thoughts are actually automatic. So not he may not even be it may not even be in his awareness, right? So he may not even be aware that he's having these, and so these are automatic, And in this case, these are negative thoughts, right? It's something negative and thought. So you can remember ants, right? An ant. Ants are annoying, right? So you want to stump the ants, and that's what we're going to try to do. But the thought about I'll be negatively perceived by my boss was sort of a superficial thing. Then through some additional what we call Socratic questions, we were able to peel the layer, and finally the thought, this ultimate thought, was that he knew he was running late. It went against his beliefs about being a responsible person, being a successful father. It went against those. These were happening subconsciously. It caused him to become alert of him feeling anxious. And then because he was feeling anxious, he either decided to not show up or he was speeding like a madman. So you see how that works? Now, what I'll try to do is to show you how to walk this path, catch this guy, figure this out, and then what you do is then you challenge it, right? And so what did we say the goal for our thinking is? What's the goal? It needs to be accurate. So, is it accurate to say that you showing up late to a single meeting for 10 minutes equals failure as a father, for example? Is that an accurate thought? And it's probably not, right? No, the answer is no, absolutely not. And so then when you're able to challenge this and make it more accurate, we call that cognitive restructuring, right? So you're taking a thought and you're trying to modify it. You're trying to restructure it, essentially. So it is more accurate. Therefore, you are dealing with the world in a rational way. Now, there are only a finite amount of ways in which people tend to have these distortive thoughts, and so we actually have labels for that. In this case, I am a failure as a father, right? That would probably be catastrophizing, potentially, right? I mean, your whole fatherhood is a failure because of showing up late. So we have, right, this thinking of worst possible outcome for a given situation. It may also entail some mind reading, right? You're reading your boss's mind. You think that he or she is going to think of you less because you showed up late without any evidence, right? So you're just making stuff up. It may also be fortune telling because as of present moment, you don't have any evidence, but you tend to predict negative future outcomes. So these are some named cognitive distortions, and you can pause the video and read them. And below, I'll take about 4 of these, the ones that I think are common, and then see how it applies. So catastrophizing, that's an example of someone really catastrophizing by saying that if they got a low score on their exam, they're going to end up homeless. or jumping to conclusion would be either through reading someone's mind. So for example, someone saying, oh, my boss hates me, I can tell by the way he looks at me. Or fortune telling, which would be predicting the future, which is something we cannot do, right? So why bother studying for my exam? I've got 30% last time, so I'll get 30% this time. So they're predicting, and predicting we cannot do, right? We cannot do predictions. We cannot do that. What we can do is generate a hypothesis, which means you're going to collect evidence, right? And see, right, whether or not you were right. But you assume, you don't assume that you're right. Emotional reasoning is often done when people are feeling helpless, feel like they don't have a whole lot of control. So often those thoughts start out with, I feel like X, Y, and Z. So you'll hear that when people get into arguments, they do a lot of so-called emotional reasoning. And then personalization is something often seen among people that tend to have a lot of perfectionistic traits. So they quickly feel guilty about everything and anything. And part of the reason is that they personalize any kind of failure that may be going around. So they attribute personal responsibility for things that they may not have any control over. And the example I gave there is that a company fails its inspection, and the individual is saying that they are the one that, the company failed the inspection because of me. In reality, they were just a tiny little droplet in a bucket of other individuals and entities responsible. So let's bring this into how these cognitive distortions, right, can sneak into causing sleep problems. So catastrophizing. So one of the thought you may have about your sleep is that you may associate some negative implications that are really catastrophic. So for example, you're trying to fall asleep, you're on the pillow, but one of the thought that might be going in your mind is that if I'm not going to be able to sleep, I'm going to get fired for underperforming. There's some prediction associated with that, but also get fired. Someone might make a comment that, hey, you look tired today, what's going on? They're not going to fire you, right? So it's a cognitive distortion. It's not an accurate thought. Jumping to conclusion. Those are some examples that I've given you about that. You can pause it and read those on your own just to get an idea. Personalization, the perfectionist, for example, will try to blame themselves somehow about their issues with sleep. Now let's specifically look at one thought that you're gonna get scored on your beliefs about sleep. So this says, after a poor night's sleep, I know that it will interfere with my daily activities the next day. So after a poor night's sleep, I know that it'll interfere with my daily activities the next day, right? So often, this should not be a surprise to you. People tend to worry about how the next day is going to turn out. My God, I can't sleep. I'm looking at the clock. It's 1 a.m. I'm going to have issues tomorrow, right? That's the prediction. So here's the issue. It's a prediction. What did we say about predictions? They cannot be true. You can make it a hypothesis, right? But it cannot be a prediction. So have you ever had a poor night's sleep where you had an amazing performance the following day and it did not affect your daily activities, right? So if you're married, right, when you're getting married, the day of your marriage and the night of your marriage, you may end up being awake with friends and family. If you're on honeymoon, you may not get a whole lot of sleep, but you look back on those days and those are some of the best days of your life, right? Assuming you're in a healthy relationship now. Similarly, if you graduated, if you're celebrating something, you may be up and the next day you function fine, right? So how do you convert that into hypotheses? Is that rather than saying I know that, it says it may, right? And rather than saying will, say it may interfere with my daily activities the next day. And if it does, so what? It's just one day of poor performance. Who cares, right? As you will learn, you're going to have excellent sleep inertia the following day if you're sleep deprived, and your body is going to be more willing to fall asleep. So now I want to introduce you to some activities, some three-step technique. One other thing I want to note here is that the third step is essentially enabling yourself. So this comes from something that I've previously taught to physicians in terms of dealing with their own stress levels is this three-step technique. So identifying the cognitive distortion, challenging the cognitive distortion, which is the cognitive restructuring part that I was mentioning, and then enabling yourself. So how do you ensure that it won't happen again, whatever it is that you're dealing with? And essentially, you do that by exactly the process that I walked you through earlier with the gentleman who was running late. So the first thing you will always realize is what? Your physical and emotional distress, right? So those were the top two circular domains, right? So those are the top two circular domains, and that is your radar, right? That is how you're going to know what's going on with you. So it may be feeling anxious, and it may be neck spasms, right? Racing heart rate. So once you determine that your body is not happy, step one in this is what ID, distortive thought, right? So step one for I is identifying the distortion you're having. And then I have given you a couple of tools there, right? So these are some techniques to help you identify what kind of cognitive distortion you're having. So step one would be I feel anxious, right? We determined that. And then you would say I feel anxious because I think, and then you'll try to fill in the blank. And often what you'll end up with is essentially this very same thing, right? So you'll end up with some superficial type of thought, and then you're going to struggle with that a little bit, right? I'm going to be negatively perceived by my boss, right? So let's clarify this. So I think, so I'm going to just, for the sake of ease, just shorthand this. So negatively perceived by boss, right? So that's the thought. I think I'm going to be negatively perceived by my boss. So you can do two techniques. You can do clarifying or clarification and implication, right? So what's the implication of this, or what does it mean, right? So earlier we went through this process up here, and what would we do? We mainly used the technique that had to do with meaning or implication, right? So what's the implication? So we're going to use the implication one. You don't have to use both techniques or tools, but how would that affect you essentially, right? So then we said, well, if it's negatively perceived, then you're not going to get that promotion, right? And then what? So what does that mean, right? So now I'm using the clarifying. What does that mean to not get that promotion? It means I'm going to get low pay. What's the implication of that? Or what does that mean? Well, I'm going to not be able to support my children, right? Kids. And then that means bad father. So I am going to be a bad father. I am a bad father, right? So that's really the thought. And so I'm a bad father. I'm a terrible father. Things like that. And that would be what? So then you would go through your list of cognitive distortions here. And then of those, I am a terrible father, for example, right? So what kind of cognitive distortion might that be? Right, so it depends on the tense. If you say I am a terrible father, you're probably catastrophizing, right? It's sort of a catastrophic state. You're calling yourself a bad or a terrible father. If you say I'm going to be, then that's probably more of fortune telling, right? So those are really for academic purposes. It doesn't matter what label you do this. So we're going to say, since this is I am a bad father, we're going to say is catastrophizing. Okay, so now we're going to go to challenge. C for challenge. So let's look at the challenge, the distortive thought. And so the issue was that I think I am a bad father, right? So another one would be called labeling. That's another cognitive distortion. We're using a label, which, right, being a father, there's a lot of labels you can use for yourself. Bad is just kind of over encompassing. So what's the evidence for or against that you're a bad father, right? So you can use this technique now to try to challenge, right? So what's the evidence for? So evidence for and against, right? That I'm a bad father, right? So you can list those there, and guess what? Most fathers are not bad fathers, right? If you're doing a decent enough job, your against evidence is going to be pretty long. That's one technique. And then the best, worst, most likely scenario works best for catastrophizing. So the worst case scenario is that you end up being labeled as a bad father. That would be sort of the worst case scenario, right? Which is what you're, right? What would be the best case scenario? That nothing happens, right? meeting was canceled. Wouldn't that be nice? So you don't have to stress over this minute thing. But what would be the most likely thing for you showing up late to a meeting? Well, the most likely scenario probably would be that they will ask you, like, hey, was everything okay? So they might be actually concerned that maybe you got into a car accident because it's so unusual for you to show up late to a meeting. Or if this is a pattern and maybe this is the third time you're late, you might get counseling from your boss, from your supervisor. But it's not going to lead to you being labeled as the worst father, for example, based on those attachments. And then finally, enabling yourself. So how do you dig yourself out of this? Just say, you know what, I don't care. I felt pretty crappy. I hate showing up late because my schema does not allow me to be late. I'm pretty rigid. I'm perfectionistic. Whatever might be the case. How do I prevent myself? How do I enable myself? Right? So what steps will I take to prevent this? Right? What other plans can I come up with? And it may be that from now on, I'm gonna change my alarm, right, back by 30 minutes. I'm just going to go to bed earlier, for example. So that's an example of this. For the sleep specifically, after a poor night of sleep, I know that it will interfere with my daily activities the next day, right? You can use the same thing, right? So poor sleep, poor activities the next day, right? So identify the distortion. So that is really a prediction, right? So you're predicting the future. So that would be what? That would be fortune telling, right? So can we predict? Not really. So that's fortune telling. And then how are you going to, the C is going to be what? The C is going to be challenging that, right? Alternative explanation, evidence for and against. So we had talked about how just because you have poor sleep one night doesn't mean it's going to affect your whole day the next day. There are times when you didn't get a lot of sleep, yet you slept pretty good, right? So that would be one way. Best, worst, most likely scenario, so you can use that technique. And then finally, enabling yourself would be using this training, for example, right? And going over the 3 weeks of modules, or getting a book, for example. So that's really what this is all about. So in summary, we have talked about how your thoughts can influence your feelings, your physical well-being, and your behaviors. And if these things, even if they're not conscious to you, if they are negative and they are inaccurate and they're irrational, it will cause you to have feelings that you don't really need to feel, right? Negative feelings. So if you could tweak this, and make them make them go through rationalizing process. And we talked about the ICE technique, then perhaps this will be more positive, right? Or at least more reality based. And if that's the case, and if the feelings improve, then the behavior is going to improve, right? If the behavior improves, then the physical well-being is going to improve, and all of these actually feed everything else, and you'll start having more positive thinking, so on and so forth. Feel free to watch this again, and there are tons of books about this. Feel free to email me if you want any recommendations, but I think these techniques, these ideas should be taught in high school so that we can live in a more rational world.